Hello! It's yesterday at 12 o'clock. Welcome here. I know it's been a long while since I made a YouTube video, but I have been stressed, and I haven't been too busy. I've just been overhyping and overstressing about these sort of big things that have been happening. But a lot of that is over, and I just finished a bunch of my classes, so my schedule has really been freed up. So hopefully this will be the last time I start a video by droning on about how I can't produce at the pace that I want to, because now I should be able to. Yay! Today, we're going to talk about having multiple stories. And does this sort of blend into the one video I made about my stories in general? Yes, in part, because I am going to be sort of redefining and again introducing everyone to my projects, but also that old video, like, I don't know how I feel about it. I don't have an outside view, obviously, so I can't tell for sure, but I feel like that video is confusing because it's loaded up with a lot of information that nobody really has any context for, and I don't think I provided that context perfectly, but I don't know. You can be the judge of that. It's whatever. This video isn't exactly a replacement either. It's just, it has parts that are similar. So, you know, let's just get into the Speedpaint so you guys know what I'm talking about. So, I have a lot of stories. If you follow me or know me, you've definitely noticed. Or I have a lot of projects. I've been saying writing projects instead of stories because it sounds more like official. I feel like people judge me sometimes if I say I write stories, and they judge me less if I say I have a bunch of writing projects I'm trying to get done. Like, you know, I actually can't decide which word I'm going to use for the title of this video, because like online I care less about people judging me, but there's like none of that. Whatever, we'll see. I'll decide that later. That's anyway. Stories, projects, writing, just writing vibes. I am an aspiring showrunner. If I don't say that in every video, I guess I die. But there's a lot to talk about when it comes to having such a job in mind, or even having other sort of project-centric jobs like aspiring or active authors. With a creative mindset, sometimes it's hard to not just get ideas, which can spark a new story just to add to a list. Which is ironic considering other times coming up with ideas feels like an insurmountable obstacle, like just something you can't get past. Especially if you want a quote-unquote original idea, it can be extra difficult. But anyway, sometimes things will just pop into your brain. Like, for me, every time I see a writing prompt, or an aesthetic board, or even when I, like, think about a trope in a TV show I'm watching, or I watch a video about a writing thing that people do a lot, something like that, I just won't be able to stop thinking about it until I've made something that goes along with it, or my version, or a subversion of it to prove to myself that I can do that I am like other writers and like creative people. And that's all fine and dandy, especially if I can find a way to sort of make an episode of one of my projects based on whatever inspired me, instead of turning that small inspiration into its own big thing. But it definitely doesn't help with a sort of frivolousness. I specifically struggle saying goodbye to stories, or like scrapping them. Even on an individual character level, I'll struggle with officially like scrapping or getting rid of characters. And instead, I just sort of keep a character, even if it's just, again, one of those loosely inspired, this is a subversion of a trope I saw people complaining about that just exists in my brain. I'll just keep them until I sort of transform and combine enough character concepts to get something that does work for a more permanent character, fixture, story, and that can be nice and very effective and very positive feeling because it feels like a lot of writing has come together and been worth it. But also, because of my tendency to do that, I have just so much space in my brain taken up by small characters and concepts, and not even just in my brain, like in documents and playlists and digital data taken up by just random things that I'm like, I'll come back to this later when I can polish it into something better. Along with adding a whole extra layer of like, you should hear about how the story was developed. Explaining that whole process takes just as long as the entire plot of the real thing. It's literally the opposite of making things easy. I am just unable to sort of whittle down and prune the immensely large jungle of, like, seemingly random creative crap in my head, which has a lot of ups and downs, honestly, but specifically, I've been thinking about it a lot, it has a large effect on producing content online, the influencer side of it all. Having a lot of stories and wanting to produce those ideas is great, but people have a hard time latching onto things that seem overwhelming, and I just don't experience that given I had often the only stake in creating the thing. I am immediately emotionally invested, and it's easy to confuse people. Sometimes confusion in an audience can be a tool, a good thing. Like, it can get people to ask questions, but more often than that, especially if confusion is unintentional, it just ends up making your audience go, this feels like more work than it does entertainment, and frankly, I don't care enough to put work and effort into figuring out all the stuff that you're bad at explaining and then just dropping it, which can be disheartening as a creator, because the main piece of advice, at least I have gotten from around different circles, is if you want people to love your creations, you have to put them out there. If you think it's interesting, at least one other person out there will think it's interesting. You just have to leave it where they can find it, which, like, yeah, that makes sense, but also I have so many things in my brain, I don't know where to put them all to keep people from getting confused and turning away even if they are interested in one of my things. This video has just been me complaining so far. Let me just stop by saying I'm going to try to keep my channel as organized as possible, and that means, like, my playlist tab is going to be useful, and so will video descriptions, because I already use video descriptions to clarify the characters featured in different videos. So if you want to not be confused, I think that'll help if I'm confusing you. I'm also obviously open to suggestions if you're struggling to follow the things that I talk about, or who everyone is. But because I have so many things in my brain, and because I don't want to confuse people, I want to keep things from blending together as much as possible, which is really what I wanted to make this video to talk about. Even this drawing is both, I think, a good way of showing how things can blend together, and also how I differentiate between projects for myself and for other people, because my creative project jungle is confusing for other people, but also can be confusing for me. So anyway, brief explanation. On one side is my character Danny. She is the protagonist from my project Camp Everrealm, and on the other side is a character from a story called World Wanderers, which, little asterisk thing here, I think last time I made a video mentioning World Wanderers, it was still called World Travelers. That's the same story, the name just changed. I might make a whole video about that just because I think it's a dumb thing. Anyway, there are two characters here, and I realized somewhat recently that they are similar. They both have green ponytails, exposed shoulders, and flowy things around their waist, which leads to a similar silhouette, which is something very important to have differentiated for different characters, and I didn't want to change either of their designs, even if their looking similar might just be something surface or something that only I will see. I wanted to think about some strategies I can use to differentiate these two characters and their stories in general. Before I get into the strategies I use to differentiate the stories, though, I should probably explain what they are. So as I said earlier, I have a whole bunch of projects, but for the sake of YouTube, I selected a couple of them that I think are the most important, the ones I want to show people the most. I've started calling them my Trinity, or the Trinity, just because I think that's funny. So first in the Trinity, as mentioned before, we have World Wanderers, which is the Rick and Morty sort of concept of traveling different dimensions, but it's for kids and teens instead of adults. Secondly, we have my Dungeons & Dragons game story project thing, also known as the Aberration campaign, which is what it sounds like. It's a game of Dungeons & Dragons. And thirdly, we have the just overly dense book of lore that is my Everrealm franchise. Everrealm is the umbrella term for a bunch of characters and projects all in the same world. So that's the Trinity. Moment of silence for the stories that were not important enough to make the cut. Gone, but not forgotten. Just kidding. They're obviously still around, but you just ignore them. So, okay, with that out of the way, methods of differentiating your stories from each other. Let's get into it. These can help actually give your stories more solid identities in general, which is always nice. The first method that I've sort of come across, I've already showcased. Give your projects specific names. Those names don't have to be completely concrete, especially if you want to produce them later. You might have to change them because of copyright stuff, but giving things names will help define what exactly it is and lead to less bleed through. And if you have a lot of stories under one sort of universe, like my Everrealm stuff, you can give it an overall title, and then you can clarify what's in it by incorporating the overall title into the individual stories. I'll give you an example. Let's see if you can guess which brand all three of these are a part of. Star Wars, The Clone Wars. Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker. Or Star Wars, I can't remember the other Star Wars movies' names. Or Camp Everrealm, Everrealm Stardust, Realm Academy, Everrealm PM, right? That's a way you can clarify. These are all individual, but they are all in one thing. All of these names have Everrealm in them. They are all a part of the Everrealm brand. Titles, also, for other stories that aren't a part of a franchise, can help you establish the vibes of your story in a succinct way. Steven Universe, let's use that as an example. That title is fun. It sounds like it'll be funny. It sounds quirky, versus something like Arcane, which sounds magical and mysterious and vaguely dark. And logos can help with that too, but not everyone has access to that. Just give your stories a name and you can immediately get rid of a lot of the confusion. Especially if you're trying to explain it to other people. If you have a name for different things, that can fix a lot of problems. Method number 2, define a genre. Make sure your story knows what it's trying to be. If it's a blend of two genres, that's great. Its genre is whatever a blend of those two is. Pop and metal both exist, and so does pop metal, Fantasy exists, sci-fi exists, and so does a mix of those two things. Again, reusing examples, Arcane and the more Force-centric Star Wars storylines are sci-fi and fantasy. But as long as you know exactly what your shows are trying to be, that can help a lot. Most of my shows are a sort of action-adventure type deal. The D&D campaign specifically leans into the more traditional fantasy vibe, and stories like World Travelers and even Stardust, which is an Everrealm story, lean towards the more sci-fi vibe. And honestly, this is sort of a subcategory of method number 2, but finding specific scales of genres, I guess, to write different stories in is really useful and actually fun. I went back and added this part to the script, but I had a lot of fun ranking my stories on scales of traditional to sci-fi, pre-modern to modern to fantasy, maturity rankings of for kids to exclusively for adults, and a sort of realistic to cartoony scale too. That can help you define both an audience and what the story is supposed to be. The third method. Within your stories, use naming conventions. This can be as simple as giving your characters names that have the same sort of vibes. A great example of this is the major characters, again, in my D&D campaign. We have Angel, Baldr, Asmund, Lawrence, Nadia. Those names all give off different specific vibes and mean different things, but when said together, they sound like they're from the same world. Once again, going back to Star Wars, it's a great example. Luke, Leia, Han, Anakin, Lando. All of these names sound like they're from the same world. And part of that is the similar sounds, but it's just, there's different ways you can do it. And at the same time, you could just go crazy with naming conventions. I did this sort of with my Camp Everrealm characters. They all have short nicknames that are easy and sound relatively similar. Danny, Lou, Co, Scott, Aaron. But they also have these weird, completely made up names that sound more magical and make them very, very distinct. And actually, along with that, if you want super spicy names, you can change the way you pronounce them by giving it a sort of in-world accent, which helps give the characters and the story and the world an identity. Like, all of the R's in these characters' full names are weird, but we have Doreno, Luxi, Koure, Skoerk, and Anorchin, which are all very similar and all very fake, so they're recognizable. Once, I even followed this person who had a major cast of characters whose names were all nouns, and they sounded similar because you were like, that's not a name, that's the word door. You can literally go as hard as you want with names, and it makes a really good way to give your story more identifiability. So, can't remember. Arguably, my favorite right now, though, that I'm experimenting a lot with, is giving your stories different aesthetics. Whether you're someone who draws your ideas, or someone who makes mood boards for your projects, or even someone that doesn't really visualize their writing at all, assigning even broad aesthetic strokes can help immensely when it comes to recognizability, especially within your own writing. Knowing what they might look like and giving a visual net to pull from can be a lifesaver when trying to define which characters and which plots happen in which stories. And it immediately conveys a mood, just as a bonus. Recently, I've been doing a lot of work assigning visual identities to my projects, and it's been literally, like, the most fun. I think the drawing I'm showing right now is an okay example of this, with one being very bright and cartoony, and the other being a lot darker, but even though they're in the same art style. The big example, though, of my differentiating between visual aesthetics is my Apparition campaign. Usually my art is in the cartoony, anime-inspired sort of range, but recently, for my D&D campaign, I've been making a lot of more detailed, darker, more realistic art that makes the story and the characters clearly their own thing, and clearly under the umbrella of a dark fantasy story. And I'm literally so obsessed with it. It shows off a completely different artistic skill set of mine too, which is really nice. It's like I have two art styles. But that's just something I think people would have fun with, even if it didn't also help differentiate stories. So that's all of the methods that I've thought of so far for differentiating between your projects. And if you have any other ones, I'd love to hear about it. And if you're still like, I have too many after trying these, honestly, my solution is to delete the story. Go to the one you care the most and say, well, it's been a good run, but you're just too much. I'm kidding, obviously. Despite all the complaining I did at the top of this video, having a bunch of stories is literally the best. There's just more stuff to love and more stuff to tell. You do have to sort of figure out your priorities, which sucks. Like picking your favorite kid, I guess. But hey, I mean, deciding where the priority is right now isn't legally binding. Deciding to work on a story and put the other ones on the back burners for a while is not a problem. It's literally how I function. It keeps me sane in the jungle of creative projects I have. And it also keeps you from getting bored of your own stuff. Creativity shouldn't be put in a box. Like, let your mind grow the jungle, because how many people get to say that they have such a vivid and expansive and honestly hard-working mind that their creativity is so dense they can literally get lost in it. Like, that's so cool. Like, live your life. But yeah, so that's my rant. Remember, you drink water. I love you the mostest. I have been yesterday. Check out my Instagram, check out my TikTok, my YouTube shorts, even if you're feeling really spicy, and I will talk to you in the next one. Bye!